All right, so this is AngularJS Quick Start, and it's meant, the audience it's meant for is are developers who have JavaScript experience, probably have used jQuery, may have toyed around with Angular a little bit, maybe not, maybe have used some other JavaScript framework. So I'm going to touch upon all of the AngularJS topics and also show how you could get started quickly using their seed project. But the intention is, Angular is a large, AngularJS contains lots of topics, and so the intention is not to go take a deep dive, but just get broad enough strokes that you could start on your own. So at Solution Street, we have done several projects in Angular for the last, I'd say, year and a half, 2 years. Some using mobile, some implemented on mobile, some on web, and have great success with it. And our clients are asking more and more about Angular. So felt it would be a good time to give a presentation on it. I have been using it for a while. I would say that I have not touched upon every aspect of Angular, but should be able to be okay through this presentation. So the first thing is why Angular? So there's a lot of discussion about this. First, there's why Angular versus other JavaScript frameworks, and then there's why Angular versus jQuery. And so there's a lot of topics to discuss. But why Angular? When you hear about Angular, it seems to have this very strong opinion behind it, and it's actually known as the super heroic framework if you Google it. And you have this image of this was taken from this website of this is a superstar framework, and I think it has a lot of positive aspects to it as a software engineer, and so you will see some of those. So the first thing is why AngularJS? What makes AngularJS a great framework? And so this is my opinion here. There's a strong separation of concerns. So in the old days in client-server, you used to have a client and you had a server, and you built them independently. Then when web came along, there was a lot of munging of those things, and you had servers serving up web pages and a lot of jQuery intermingled. So this really believes in a strong separation of concerns, where you can have the separation of your client, your Angular app, and then your server app. And so you can test them independently, and there's a lot of benefit of doing that. So separation of HTML, JavaScript to CSS. You build UI declaratively. This is a key point of Angular. You're sort of building upon the HTML5 spec. You're creating new elements, new attributes, and so it's very different from the way you think about programming the UI, especially if you've done jQuery. jQuery is all about manipulating the DOM. Angular is more about building upon HTML. So you have to get your mind wrapped around that, and it takes a little while, but I'll go into some detail there. Dependency injection, for those of you who have done Spring and other things that brought dependency injection to the forefront, it uses dependency injection, which, why is that important? It's important because you can test in isolation, you can mock objects, it makes it easier to have a stronger system. There's no direct via code manipulation of the DOM. Again, this is when you first, I sort of equate Angular, the comparison here is PHP is to, PHP is to jQuery as Ruby on Rails is to Angular. So in the early days, when web first came out, everyone was using PHP, and it's the quick and easy way to get websites going. Then, similarly, when jQuery came out, everyone was, wow, I could do that to the DOM, and so there's not as much control of your environment and of architecture around PHP, assuming you're not using a framework, and jQuery. And then the same thing with Ruby on the opposite side. Ruby on Rails came about and is the, in my opinion, the better PHP is sort of taken web development to a more structured software engineering principle type architecture with Rails. And the same thing is with Angular. It's very opinionated, as my last comment makes. So that could be good. Some people like that. A lot of people like that. They're software engineers, but some people don't like that. Models are regular JavaScript objects, and for those of you familiar with JavaScript and objects, it's just using your standard JavaScript objects, which makes it easy. So what about jQuery and Backbone? And you can name any other Ember, Knockout.js, and any other JavaScript framework. So what about those? So I think from my perspective, and I think the Solution Street perspective, is that it depends on the system. It depends what you're building. If you're building a fairly light UI or not UI intensive in terms of a lot of communication, a lot of sort of very heavy UI, then maybe jQuery is right. Maybe a Backbone is right. Maybe just some simple JavaScript in your website. But if you're building anything that is heavier on the UI, maybe more than a couple of pages, more involved, certainly Angular makes a lot of sense. And it's very debatable. There's a lot of discussion out there on this. But I think for the most part, it takes a little bit more to go towards Angular. There's a little bit more ramp-up time for people to learn, a little bit more involved. And it's worth it if you're doing a larger UI app, like we've done at Solution Street and other people have done. It does follow the model view model pattern. A lot of you are familiar with the different patterns out there. I won't go into detail here, but that's essentially the pattern that it follows.
Angular, the one from Google, or is that Ember?
So the question was, I'm just repeating for, is Angular the one from Google or is that Ember? So Angular is the one from Google, and it has a pretty strong team and support, open source community around it. People help adding to not just Angular, but all of the widgets and other supporting what's called directives. People are building around it. Any questions? Yeah.
Can the AngularJS be deployed with Node.js?
Yeah, can AngularJS be deployed with Node.js? The answer is yes, and I'll actually show you. It's a great lead to. I'll show you that the Angular seed project expects you to use Node, but you could use Angular as we have done with Rails. You could use it with any backend, any cloud-based. You could use it with Firebase, which is a cloud-based service backend system. You could use it with Java, .NET, anything on the server side, or just alone. So the first thing we'll talk about is modules. And actually, before we get into modules, let's just talk about single-page apps. Some people here may not be familiar with a single-page app. It's also a little bit, takes a little while to get used to. So most web applications historically have been built with request and response, where you're going to the server, it's coming back with a request, a response that's HTML, could contain jQuery, and each request comes back with a new, you're replacing the page. Single-page app, as I could read the definition, an app that only requires the browser to load just a single page. So we're not going back each time to reload the HTML. We have the assets all on the client side, and anything we need from the server, we're making typically a JSON request call. So we make a call to the server, typically a REST call. Let's say it's get me my list of accounts. That would come back with a JSON response, and Angular or any single page app framework would take that data and display it on the UI. And so all of the assets are in the client, in the browser. This also opens up questions and issues potentially for security, or am I bearing my soul to the world by showing them all my JavaScript and CSS? But this is a pattern, a single page app that a lot of frameworks are using, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So you do need to handle a lot with single page apps. There's data binding, which we'll talk about, history, routing, caching, DOM manipulation, and obviously AngularJS does that all for you. So the first thing we'll talk about is the module. And a module is the highest level of the Angular app. It contains all the other components that are within Angular. So a module could depend upon other modules, and a module can contain controllers, services, directives, and filters. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. We define the container with ngapp, and modules declare the namespace and provide routing logic with templates. Okay, that was a lot, but what we'll do here, before we get over to that, I'll swap over to, I'm using RubyMine. You can use any editor. WebStorm is usually used, or you could just use any basic Sublime Text or any editor. So this is Angular Seed, which is a project you could pull from GitHub, and I'll show you how to do that. And in here, we have an index page. And so people are familiar with an index page. And what you'll notice here is that there's this ngapp up there. I could actually use fancy annotations here. There's an ngapp right there. And so that in your HTML, that defines that this is the container. This is the module of my Angular environment. And so you need that. You could have multiple modules working. I'd say for simplicity, and at least in my experience, it's always been one module here. So this is my app. Coming back, I'm including all of the other JavaScript files. Depending on how you deploy this, this could be like this, where you're showing each individual file, or you could have it some other method. And let me go to the actual module, which in this case, I'm declaring my module. Again, this is the highest level component, and it's called my app. Typically, it'd be whatever the name is of your application, right? So this is Angular Seed by default, comes down with this. And it's including other modules. It's including ng. Ng is the two-letter character shortened name for Angular. So if you see ng anything, that's usually Angular. And then it includes filters, services, directives, controllers that Angular Seed has, well, that you would define as a user, as a programmer. But in this case, we are defining a module that's containing these other modules. In practice, you have the choice of doing this, or you could just have your module and your controllers just fall into that module, as opposed to defining another module and you're including that module. So in the case here, this my app directives is a module, and this module is being included in this module. Makes it a little confusing. In practice, we tend to just have a directive using the my app module, and I'll show you that when we create a new one. What you notice here are routes, and these routes, similar to if you're used to struts, they're defining the route that a user takes. So if the user goes to /view1, they use this HTML file, which is their template, and they use this controller. Standard MVC, I'm assuming everyone knows MVC, standard MVC practice, and this is important in the module. So swapping back to the presentation here. This is
Arthur,
yes.
So this sample isn't a single page app.
It is.
It is.
Yes. So what you saw with the routes, even though it looks like it's going to /view1, as we will see, it actually goes to #/view1, and the browser's not going back to the server. It's just looking locally in its browser assets for that template, and it's doing everything on the browser.
Okay. So the two HTML files.
Yes. They will
combine into one, or be inserted into one.
They're partial, so you're going to get like your overall page, and you're going to have just the segment broken out of, for instance, you have a tab on one page, you have tab 1, tab 2, you have a partial 1, change tab. So it's kind of like embedded in one page.
Yeah, so the browser is swapping back and forth.
Right.
So back in this picture was, I thought the best, this is a great presentation, by the way, by Dan Wallen, AngularJS in 60 minutes. So this is a great slide that really enabled me to understand Angular at this level. So the module is the highest level, which we saw the file. In that case, it was called app.js. In any, it might be called whatever your app's name, .js. It has configuration, which we haven't seen much of, and routes, which we did see. And those routes reference controllers, and they reference views, the HTML. The controllers are JS files. And between them, they deal with scope, which is your model. And we'll talk more about scope, and you'll see how that works. Controllers have references to factories and services. We'll talk about that. And views can use directives. And directives are ways to, essentially, you're extending HTML5. You're creating your own widgets in HTML. And we'll talk about that. Sure.
Is that dynamic and default routes like, well, if you don't declare a route explicitly, at the end, it's going to look at slash, this controller slash, whatever.
Yeah, no, you can do that. As you see here, there's it's this otherwise statement.
That's always directive.
Right. Yeah. So you're saying, can you?
Yeah, can you say if it's slash foo slash bar, always look for a corresponding partial with its name and a
I see. Right.
Yeah, but the default is not the explicit one.
Right, right. So the question is, can you, based on the URL, can you specify? So in the URL, yes, I don't have an example here, but typically in any CRUD type processing, there would be things like the ID. So similar to Rails, you would see the :ID here as part of the URL. Now, whether you can dynamically, based on that, do what you're saying, I think you can. You would have access to either this either $route provider, which is provided by Angular, and there's also events. So there's on-change events, and there's other things that you have access to that you might be able to manipulate. So coming back to the presentation. So this is, as I said, a good slide. So getting started. So this is, unfortunately, in our world, there's always many ways to do things, and in Angular, there's no difference. There seems to be a lot of starting projects. So there's Angular Seed, which I like because it's fairly light to get started. A lot of people also use Yeoman, which is more of a scaffolding generator that you could specify. I'm using Bootstrap with it. I'm using various components, and it'll bring it in. And there's probably 10 or 20 other things you could start out with that will seed a project. I'm using this as an example because I think it gives what it does give, and you can look at the GitHub account. It does give a starting point that's very easy to get started. It does use Node, as was asked before. It does use, I think, Bower for components, and it has the testing frameworks as part of it. So unit testing and end-to-end testing, just out of the gate. So you could follow these instructions. What we see here is, we look over here, I'm running Node.js here. I started it, and if you run Angular Seed out of the box, you get this, which doesn't look like much. It's not much, but it gives you the framework. If you remember from the routes, there was view 1 and view 2. You notice the hashtag here. You could actually change Angular to not have the hashtag. But what these are doing, if you look at inspect element, these are not making a network call back to the server. It's just using the assets in place. If these were doing anything from a server perspective, you'd see a JSON call going back and forth. So, okay. And back to the presentation. So if we go to the next topic, so this is the directory structure of Angular Seed. And as I mentioned before, you could do this many different ways. On the projects we have here, we do this slightly differently. But you can see that there's an app directory and a test directory. That obviously makes sense. The CSS, image, index, and then they separate partials and JS files. The partials are your HTML files. The JS files are your JavaScript files, which could be controllers, directives, filters, services. And people tend to not have, in this particular case, Angular seed includes multiple controllers in one JS file. Typically, they would be, each controller would be a separate JS file, as you would normally think of it. And in addition, you probably would have the directory structure as either controllers, directives, and filters, and each of your controllers are in those directories and filters and so forth. Or you would slice them by business logic, which I've seen a lot of discussion on that in Angular, where let's say you had user and account, and under account you would have your account controller, your account services, and whatever else related to the account. So you could, it's open to however it's best for you. Under test, we'll get to that after. So I showed before, this is the module. It's just a screenshot of the module code that we saw before. It's nothing really fancy. This is where you would also interject HTTP calls. So for example, let's say you wanted to do authentication, or authorization for that matter. You would inject something in here that every time it comes through the Angular entry point, you would capture that, make sure that the person was authenticated. Maybe you're checking for 403 errors or 401 errors, and you could handle them globally here. That's another thing that's done in the module.
How about the authentication done? Like when on another job?
Right. So the authentication is up to the user. So if you envision that this is a separation of concerns, so you have a JavaScript client and you have a server. So you have to figure out how the authentication is done. And in our cases, that what we've done is we have server-side authentication, and it's usually a token that comes back stored in the cookie, and then you also have to deal with CSRF, and you have to deal with cores. I won't go too deep in those aspects, but you have to look into those. So there's a lot of, it's harder, right? Because you're having the separation of concerns. You have to deal with all these things slightly differently. So controllers are what most people know of controllers from the MVC world. They are used to set up the model for the view. They handle events, and they do not store state. So this is the controller file that comes with Angular Seed, which is really two controllers, which is unorthodox, at least from my perspective. They do nothing, but we can see, I'll pull them up here. So this is the format here. This is Angular. This is creating a new module called my app controllers module, which was brought into the main module. And it's declaring a controller, two controllers, my controller 1 and my controller 2, that do nothing. Nothing there. We'll add to that. Scopes. So scope is where the view consumes variables from. Scope is the view model. It's really your data. And $scope, the term that I've seen, isolation, this is my pond. So you can define within the context of where your controller's at of a block of HTML. You define what the actions are, what the events are related to that block of HTML, and you're defining what the data is within $scope. So you could add $scope first name, $scope last name, and that data is within the confines. That's your model. That's your controller is dealing with. It is hierarchical. You can have parent scopes and root scopes that. Because your HTML in some ways is hierarchical, the way you're dealing with your divs. It's a tougher topic to go into, so I'm just touching upon that, but just know that exists. Root scope is at the top, and others inherit from root scope. And AngularJS specific vars and functions start with a $sign to not get serialized, and also to not collide with the name. POJOs, that's the model. We're going to see examples, so it'll become clear. So the view, after we talk about the view. This is a key slide that I found on understanding AngularJS's two-way binding model, which is different than some of the other single-page app frameworks. So normally in jQuery, what you would do if you had a drop-down of, let's say you had a drop-down of some country maybe, or state, and then that affected the country or country, and then that affected the states that show up, you would have to write some code that said evaluate the value of this, and then change the values of these things, right? So based on what the user selects in the HTML, you need to change the model, so to speak. So in Angular, there's what's called automatic two-way binding. And so you have your templates, which is your HTML, that get compiled to the views. And you also have your model, which is what's in the $ scope. And if you update the view, it automatically updates the model. If you update the model, it automatically updates the view. We'll take a look. And AngularJS uses interpolation with the double squigglies. And we'll see, let's take a look at some examples here. So the first thing, and my examples here are in GitHub. I'll send that out after. What's that? Are they using handlebars as the covers? That's a good question. So the first one is a two-way binding example. So let's look at the code first. And what I'll do is I'll look at the changes in the code to give an idea. So first in the module, we want to add a new route. So we're going to call this quick start. I don't know if I have to annotate because it's already annotated. Quick start view. So when you go to quick start view, we're using a new template called quick start partial and a new controller. Makes sense? And in our controller, all we are doing, we're actually reusing the module that we had before, and we're adding a controller to it. And we're calling it quick start one. And we're going to, this is where dependency injection comes into play. We're injecting $scope. We're saying in this controller, we're going to use $scope that Angular provides. You'll notice it's in here twice, once as a string and once as a variable. And the reason for that is minification. When you minify JavaScript files, and if you do not have the string representation, the double representation here, it wouldn't know, Angular wouldn't know, because when you minify the JS files, it munges the variable names. And so it would be a problem. So you have to do it in this format. So you'll see in Angular, sometimes people do the shortened format where they don't specify this as a string. And that won't work when you minify. So other times you'll see it like this. So all we're doing here is we're saying scope.name. This is the first time Angular knows of .name. You could put .foo, .arthur, it doesn't matter. It's just an attribute off of scope, and I'm setting it to Jane Doe. And then in the partial, all it is there's an input text, and I reference ng model. So again, ng, Angular, I'm saying that this input text, the model associated with this is name. So it becomes part of scope.name, because I'm within the confines of this scope. And you notice I use the double squiggly lines over here, brackets, for .name. So fundamentally what should happen is when the page shows up, because scope.name is Jane Doe, I should see Jane Doe here. All right? And because I have an input text that's also changing my variable, as I'm changing my variable, it should also change the view. Right. So the other part here is I just added the JS file and I added a link to the. So I just refresh my screen.
Could you have added the quick start controller to the controllers.js?
Yes. And then I wouldn't have to do anything. I'm just showing a different way that typically you would have it separate. So here I have this two-way link. I click on that. I see name is Jane Doe. I have no styling, so it's a little difficult to see. Change the name, so I delete that. You notice how right above it, it's automatically doing that. So everyone here probably has used jQuery. You know how you could do that pretty cool in jQuery, but with more lines of code. Right? Maybe some of you might be jQuery experts could do that easily. So you can see the power of doing that automatically. 98% of the time you want that to happen. The other two you have to deal with. But this automatic two-way binding is very useful in a lot of ways. There's less code. I think it's less than other frameworks that I've seen. Okay, the second knockout, you have to set a few more things. Yeah. So let me check out step 2. These are just branches in the GitHub example repository. So with this example, I'm using a server-side call to the iTunes API. So I will So in this case, I added a new controller. And what this is doing, this is my new Quick Start 2 controller. I won't go into the same. I'm also injecting $HTTP, which is what you would think it is. It's a way to do gets and posts to services. So here, this is an event listener. So anytime I call the search function from my template, right? So you can imagine that. I want to make an HTTP JSONP call to the iTunes Open API call, doing a search, passing these params, including this $scope search term. So somewhere in my template, I have to call this. Right? You can start thinking ahead. I have to call this, and somewhere I have to define what the search term is, the band I'm looking for, the artist, the musical artist I'm looking for. If success, then iTunes results. I'm setting a new variable equals whatever the data is I get back. Otherwise, I have a very poor error handling here using this. So this is there's more advanced. There's better ways to do this with promises. These are called promises, and you could use in Angular they've added to that. You could use thens and other things, but I'm leaving that for future discussion. So on the HTML side, on the partial side, this is a little bit more formatted, but I'll point out the important parts here. So one of the things is this ng model search term. So it's an input text, so you can think I'm typing in some artist name. That becomes my model. Remember, once I type it in, the controller knows about the change immediately, so it's going to make the call. I'm sorry, that's not true. It's only when I submit, if it could do that, but it's only when I submit and I actually do this ng click to call the search function. It could be as I'm typing, but we don't want to do that because then we're making service calls all the time. But in this case, it's only when I do this ng click, which is what you would think it would be on click of a button here. And then when I get the results back, I'm getting them back as a collection, an array. So you'll notice here there's an iterator here, ng repeat. So what I'm saying here is just iterate through my results and put that in poorly named result. And once I have that, I can reference within this div, I can reference my results URL, the URL of the song, maybe some artwork of the song. These are all defined by the iTunes API, the attributes, and the artist name.
Why do you have to use ng?
Only because I'm using the interpolation, yeah.
So it doesn't just replace anything.
Right.
Do you need to put ng? I know sometimes you need to put ng in front of it.
If you just had source, yeah, that's it's.
Sometimes you don't need ng in front of it.
Well, yeah, some people do. Well, some people put data in front of it because that's more HTML5, if that's what you're getting at. But you might be able to get around without using the ng in front of it. But I think it's good practice, especially if you're using. Yeah, it's an Angular. And then here we're just adding another link and adding the file.
Question?
Yes.
So Angular gets criticized for breaking the monolithic JavaScript paradigm that going for because now if I give this to a designer who only knows HTML, there's a high chance that they might break JavaScript, even though.
Right. So does Angular get criticized for sort of breaking the HTML paradigm. I think jQuery, yeah. I'd say the answer to that is probably yes, but I think they've also gained a lot of respect for their use of directives and other things that are trying to expand the use of HTML, HTML5.
They provide an alternative to put less logic in the template and somewhere else.
Less logic in the template. Well, you don't want you try not to have logic in the template, right? So most of your logic. So you could do filter. You could do other things that externalize your logic elsewhere. It depends on what you're trying to do. So if you're having too much logic in your template, then you may need a filter. You may need a directive. It may need to be a service. You may need more in your controller. You have to kind of analyze that as it goes.
Okay, I'm just thinking about it. Say like you have a partial, right?
Right.
You use in 2 different statements.
Right.
They have the same submit, but then you want them to print false. And depending.
You want to reuse the template, maybe?
You want to reuse the partial. Yeah.
You want to reuse the partial, yeah. So you could reuse the partial,
Okay.
and then as part of directives, directives can include templates. So there's different ways that you can componentize that to make it dry. So I think in this case, I have this this iTunes API. I click on that, and I'm just going to search for YouTube. I submit. There we go. And coming back with, with that little amount of code, I made a call to the iTunes API, and I'm coming back with all this data here.
You don't need that search, but you could do it as you type in different characters, and that would be really cool.
That, as I said, but then you're hitting the network too much.
Make sure that value is greater than 3 characters.
Right. So you could do that. So and I'll show a little bit of that with a filter I have on after. So in this example, right, so I can sure, let's see, that goes to the iTunes. I forgot where it went to. But you could all right, so with that little code we did that.
What's the HTML being built? JSON gets back, right?
Right, so it comes back and upon success, I don't need these other variables because I'm not using them, but upon success, it's setting iTunes result as a scope, as a variable on the scope, and then in the HTML, you could put ng repeat on this div here, and within the iTunes API, you have to know that there's a results collection within that. And I'm just iterating over that with the result, and then I have access to that result, and then so I could reference result.preview URL and other things off of that. Yeah. So this is iterating. This exactly. So this div is. I'm sorry. Within this div, this div is iterating. Frenzy repeat. Yeah. Okay. So let's go on to some more semi-complicated things. So services, I'll rush through this. So services can be used to manipulate data. They centralize access. They're singletons. Everyone knows what a service is. Examples of Angular services, $HTTP, $location. $location enables you to change the URL. And then, as everyone knows about your different concepts of services, factories, and providers. Angular has all three, and I referenced this link. It goes into detail as to what the differences are, but fundamentally they're quite similar, and you could use any of the above. But they're all singletons, and they act in a similar fashion. So let's just show. So one of the things as far as drying up the code, you might want to use that API all over the place. You have a RESTful API, and instead of rewriting that code to do the search or what have you, you might want to put that put that code in a singular place, and that would be a service. So in this case, we want to include ng resource. Ng resource is an Angular. It's an Angular directive to allow you to easily make RESTful API calls to any service. So in this case, I'm just including that as a module. I also include it in my index.html. It has to be included as a separate JS file. And then in my controller, I have this commented out, which you normally wouldn't do, but just to show you of what I'm replacing with the non-commented out code. Instead of calling this, we're going to move this code to a service, and then we're just going to call that quick start iTunes service and handle that much simpler. And all of that other code went to the service file using ng resource. So I'm injecting $resource. Here I did it the wrong way. If I minified this, this wouldn't work. I really need to have, I need to have something like, I can't do it here, but I really need to have a string representation of $resource here. And what I'm saying is, use this resource and allow the action of get. And get is actually the default, so I don't even need this. And there's a lot more complicated and a lot more in-depth tutorials on ng resource. And I just wanted to touch on the topic because most of what people write, most of what we write is going to be RESTful APIs. So this is how you would dry up your code and have separate resource files for dealing with the communication to the server. So by doing this, the code is exactly the same. I'm still doing the same code, but I'm drying up my code. Any questions on ng resource? So if we go to directives. So directives, anyone references this from? No? Star Trek, the prime directive? Okay, there we go. You never mess with the prime directive. So directives, teaching HTML new tricks. You can restrict the directive to an element, attribute, class name, comments. You could use a template or template URL. There's all sorts of attributes associated with directives. Do you replace the div, or do you append to the div? What is the scope that the directive is dealing with? Transclusion. You get into all sorts of crazy things, and I just referenced this Hitchhiker's Guide to the Directive to show. So I'm going to give a simple example of a directive. So let's just say you're looking at your app here, and you say, well, I want to know the cost of these songs. So the cost could be whatever, $9.99 and $14.99 and so forth. And your client is saying, well, let's show the bar differently based on the price. I want to show a larger bar if it's more expensive, a smaller bar if it's less expensive. So what we need to do is, what we'll do is create a simple directive here. I guess I can just step arrow. And what we'll see in the code, oops, did I do that right? So I'm going to create a new directive. And this is the syntax of the directive. I'm saying add to my module a directive called cost bar. And in that, I'm restricting it to an attribute. And actually, in my example, it probably should be an element. But it could be, A means attribute as an HTML attribute. And I can keep that as element or other things. When Angular has compiled the HTML, I want to take a value, the value of my cost bar that's in my template. So I'm going to say, I'm going to use a variable, you'll see, that says it's like we saw before, results. It was iTunes results, so result.cost or whatever the thing is. And I'm going to pass that in, so to speak, in my template. And so I have access to that value. And I'll floor the value just so $10.99 becomes 10. It doesn't really matter, just as an integer. And then I'm going to append this small form of HTML. This is a very simple example. In directives, you could bring in charts. You can bring in anything that, and you would use a directive when you want to dry up your code, when you see multiple places to use the same sort of code. All right, it's a very powerful tool. So here in this case, I'm creating a bar. I'm using some fancy CSS to make this look good, and the value here, the width, is going to be the value. All right, so and then I'll show the value along with it. So if we go back in the partial, what I'm doing here as part of my iteration through the results of iTunes, I'm coming back and I'm saying this div cost bar. You see how I just created this new attribute called cost bar. So now that Angular knows about this new attribute, this could have been and probably should have been an element. You know, I could have just made this an element called cost bar. And I'm passing in the value, and we'll see what happens.
It's like your own custom two-way binding.
It's a custom two-way binding. Yeah, you're expanding on the HTML5 here. So I refresh this, do my same search, and now I have this bar. So this is $9.99, $14.99, obviously a little bigger. So this was with a simple directive, I could do this. Now this is a simple, very, very simple example just to show how it's done. But you could see how you could expand on this if you have an app that's using charts in different places, or it's using a similar type of form, or it's doing a similar type of display in certain areas of your app that you want to contain, contain that into some single directive that you could reuse all over the place, and you could test in isolation. Any questions? Yes.
How do you prevent namespace flagging since you use other people's directives?
How do you deal with the namespace of using other people's directives?
Is there like context and prevent two directives?
Right. So most directives. So if you see, I don't have it here, but so if you're including other directives that other people put out, usually they append in a dot notation, like a namespace. If you were publishing your own directive, you'd probably do the same thing. Okay. So filters. So filters format the value of expression for display of the user, create custom filters, array manipulation. So filters in a list, you could always think of that. I'll go quickly here because I want to get through this. So in this case, from a business perspective, I have my list of songs, but after I did my search, when it comes back to the browser, I want to filter on the browser. So let's say I wanted to filter after it comes back from the, what comes back from the server, let's just say is 1,000 or 100. And I want to filter on in the browser. So here what we do is we're just filtering in the template. So as we're iterating through the results, we pipe filter within filter. And what this is referencing is this variable that we're typing in. So as we're typing in this input text within filter, it will be filtering the results for you. This is a very, very simplified form of filter. You could write custom filters where you may want to format differently or sort differently or whatever, which requires some coding. This is a very simplified Angular filter. And I'm only going to show this input text. This is outside of the filter concept. I'm using ng-show, a Boolean operation that says, do I show this or not? Is it visible or not? So whatever the value is within this quote here, I'm only going to show this div to enable you to filter if this value is true. So if there are results, show the filter. If not, don't show the filter. So I'm just showing a different concept, not related to filter, but just piggybacking this on. So if I come back here and I do the same query, and now I have all of these songs, and I say, well, I only want songs from U2 18. So as I'm typing it in, you can see, like, I don't even get to the, it's filtering. Or, from Mandela. So as I'm typing it, it's constantly doing it. So very powerful, and if you write your custom filters, it works the same way, except you have your own code. Okay, testing. Probably should do that first. So Angular does, with Angular Seed, it comes with two types of testing. It's unit testing and end-to-end testing. So both use Jasmine, which is, I don't know if anyone has used Jasmine before, but it enables you to easily test JavaScript code. And on the front end, I'm sorry, on the unit test side, it's using Karma Test Runner, which is a continuous testing tool. So you keep that running, and as you're writing tests, it'll tell you when it breaks. On the end-to-end side, it's using Protractor, which behind the scenes is using Selenium. So we could just see, so if I just do an npm run, I'm sorry, npm test, this is going to start a Chrome browser. It'll run through the tests, and if I was to change something in the test logic, on the unit test side, if I'm testing a controller, and you know, if I just change that, I think, oh, never mind. Maybe that doesn't work. I would think that this would be running oh, there we go. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it doesn't show up here for some reason. It just shows it connected, but it just showed that there was an error here. This is typical nowadays for continuous running of unit tests. I'll revert that. And then the end-to-end testing is actually. This will start a Selenium standalone server, as it says, and we'll run through the integration tests, bringing up a browser window, and just quickly going through all. It was too fast, but you saw the test. So just to give you a context here, so for example, a controller spec. You know, here, let's just say. Actually, let me bring up my examples. So if I bring up. So here I added a unit test for the directive, right? So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying describe cost bar. This is part of Jasmine formatting. And when I'm injecting also the root scope and compile. So when I compile this value, this is an example. I'm saying that let's say the cost was $10.50. I expect it to come out like this. This is a very simplified form of a unit test, passing an example and coming back, but this is how you would do it for the unit test perspective. And for my end-to-end test, I'm just saying, let's hit that iTunes API search, and if I get to that page, I expect just to see the text on that page to match this text. So again, just a very, very simplified version of this, not too much detail. But what I like about Angular Seed, it gives you all of this out of the box of just running these, and they all run successfully. You could add to them. Where do you go from here? So there's a lot to talk about with Angular, and especially doing single-page apps. Someone brought up before about authentication. I think there's a lot of reading to do, a lot of discussion on authentication, authorization, because you're separate. Your client is separate from your server, and how you deal with issues like CSRF and CORS. Form validation, most apps have forms, and Angular has done a lot in the form area to deal with validation and just make it simplified in terms of templates. There are great video tutorials on Angular from Egghead.io. I highly suggest those. There are meetups. We had a meetup this week here at Solution Street for AngularJS, and then all the questions on Stack Overflow and keeping up with the latest that Angular has going on. Any questions from anyone on the call or anyone here? Yes. Caching. Yeah. Yeah, so like local storage in the browser. Yeah, so it has directives, it has modules that help you deal with that. At some level, you're on your own, and then if you're a mobile device, you do different things than if you're on a web in a web browser.
I saw some Dependencies somewhere there.
Yeah.
Does that mean the server has some more Dependencies?
No, for that particular example, it was just the iTunes API we're using JCP. You can call it with a $http.get or a .post.
Use that $Ajax, JSON?
What's that?
$Ajax? Or?
No. You don't want to use any jQuery. That's sort of a no-no. But Angular has a $HTTP.get, which is similar to your Ajax, your jQuery Ajax call.
So it's not common to use both jQuery and Angular.
It's
using Bootstrap and jQuery. So it's a given.
Oh, it's a given. Yeah. There are people who wrap jQuery in Angular directives, and there is actually, but it's regarded as you don't want to go down that path. You don't want to change. Using jQuery is you don't want to muck with the DOM directly. So it's one of those things where you try to stay away from because you realize it's not the right way, the Angular way. And then once you start coding in the Angular way, you start to get used to it, and you realize, well, once I start mucking with the DOM, then all things are off. Any questions? Yeah.
You may not be able to answer this in a real way, but I mean, how does using these extended JavaScript libraries and frameworks is new to me.
Right.
How does Angular compare to some of the other frameworks that you mentioned?
Yeah.
Either in terms of use or.
Yeah. So the question was, how does Angular compare to other frameworks out there?
Should I tackle on one real quick?
Sure.
Specifically Ember, because I see a lot of Angular versus Ember.
Angular versus Ember. Yeah. So I don't know. I know I've used Knockout. I've used a little Backbone. And there is the famous To-Do app that you could pull down from GitHub that has the implementation of all of these JavaScript frameworks, and you could take a look. I could tell you that at Solution Street we've done some research into each one of these and made a judgment call a year and a half ago. There's certainly a strong group of people who want Ember and Knockout and Backbone. I would say that it seems like, so the difference is, it seems like, I could tell you that Ember and Knockout and Angular are close in terms of how they address certain things, and whereas Backbone is less of a framework dictating to you how to use it, and it's more of just a little bit more of an organization structural thing that helps on top of a jQuery or anything else like that. Angular seems to have less code because of its automatic two-way binding and some of the directives and some of its niceties. But I couldn't tell you, it's so hard to keep up with, all the technology. I couldn't tell you who's winning out. It seems like Angular, I can tell you from the clients we've talked to, that Angular has come up more in conversation certainly than Ember and Backbone and Knockout combined.
Yeah. I think especially with Google products now, they're really pushing it.
Yeah. It seems to have a lot of popularity, yeah. And you'll notice Yeah, yeah. Cool. I mean, I seem to notice a lot more discussion on Angular, a lot more meetups, a lot more people engaged.
This is from Google. How is it done SEO? Because that was one of the main issues with JavaScript, right?
Right.
They're very funny.
Yeah. So I don't think this is the question that has SEO and indexing. I don't know the answer to that in terms of Angular in the sense that I don't think they provide anything to help with that. I think it's like any sort of SPA, single page app. There are lots of there's lots of discussion on how to do that. But that's a good question. I don't know. Angular may have something that helps with that. You certainly could take out the hashtag. You don't need the hashtag in the URL, but that doesn't help with SEO. Anything else? Okay. Thanks for everyone.
Thank you.